The entire first-class lounge of Toronto Pearson International Airport went silent the moment a security supervisor's hand came down hard on the shoulder of a quietly seated black woman, rattling the untouched glass of sparkling water beside her leather carry-on. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me." The supervisor's voice was loud enough to carry across 3 rows of ivory leather chairs, deliberately so. Craig Ellison had been working Terminal 1 security for 11 years, long enough to develop the particular brand of institutional arrogance that comes not from competence, but from the unchallenged repetition of small abuses. He was a broad man with a pink, perpetually flushed face and the practiced posture of someone who had spent a decade reminding people that he controlled access to rooms they wanted to be in. He had spotted the woman the moment she walked through the priority pass entrance without pausing at the desk. Just a brief nod to the attendant and straight to a window seat, moving with the unhurried ease of someone entirely at home in spaces like this. That ease was what had bothered him. Colonel Nadia Osei-Harrington of the Royal Canadian Air Force sat with her spine perfectly straight, a half-read copy of The Economist open across her knee. At 44, she had the kind of contained stillness that comes from commanding people under live fire, a calm so deep it registered to untrained observers not as composure but as arrogance. She wore civilian clothes. A structured charcoal blazer, dark trousers, a single strand of pearls her late mother had given her, the morning she graduated from Royal Military College in Kingston. Her boarding pass for the direct flight to London Heathrow sat folded in the breast pocket of her blazer, business class, row 2, seat A. She looked up from her magazine slowly. Her eyes met Ellison's with an expression of polite, surgical patience. "I beg your pardon?" "There's been a complaint," Ellison said, lowering his voice now that he was closer, not out of courtesy, but because he preferred his confrontations at a register where witnesses couldn't quite make out the words. "From another guest. We've had a report that you may have entered this lounge using someone else's credentials." Nadia closed The Economist. She placed it neatly on the seat beside her. "I used my own credentials," she said, "my Maple Leaf Gold card. The attendant at the entrance verified it." The attendant made an error. Ellison pulled a small tablet from his belt holster and tapped it twice with a performative authority. "Our system flagged an irregularity. Standard procedure is for you to accompany me to the verification desk outside the lounge while we sort it out." Outside the lounge. The phrasing was precise and deliberate, not to a desk inside. Out, through the glass doors, back into the general terminal in front of everyone waiting at the adjacent gates, stripped of the quiet dignity of this particular room. Nadia had been in uniform and out of it long enough to recognize exactly what this was. She had been flagged before, in hotel lobbies, in hospital wings, in officers' messes on bases where her rank should have made her invisible to this kind of scrutiny, and somehow never quite did. She recognized the shape of it the way you recognize weather. "I would like to speak to your direct supervisor," she said, her voice even and unhurried. "I am the supervisor on duty," Ellison replied, a small satisfied tightening at the corners of his mouth. "And this lounge operates under my authority during this shift. Now, if you'll come with me." "I won't," Nadia said, simply without heat. The word landed in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. Ellison's jaw shifted. "Ma'am, if you refuse to cooperate with a legitimate security request, I am authorized to contact the airport's police liaison and have you escorted from the premises." "Then I'd suggest you do that," Nadia said, "because that will move us to a setting where everything that happens next is formally documented." She tilted her head, just slightly. "Is that what you'd prefer?" The lounge had not returned to its ambient murmur. 11 other passengers were watching. A retired schoolteacher from Winnipeg, with her reading glasses halfway down her nose, a pair of business travelers from Calgary who had both stopped typing, a young woman near the window who had already positioned her phone at an angle that wasn't quite casual. At the entrance desk, the attendant who had greeted Nadia, a young woman named Priya who had been working this lounge for 3 years, and who had personally verified Nadia's credentials twice, once on the system and once on the secondary reader because the first had glitched, was standing with her hand hovering over the internal phone. Ellison hadn't noticed Priya. He rarely noticed the people who actually ran the desk. "I'm giving you one more opportunity to comply voluntarily," he said. Nadia reached into the breast pocket of her blazer and withdrew not her boarding pass but a second card, matte black, government issued, bearing the crest of the Department of National Defense and a rank designation that Ellison would have recognized immediately if he had ever bothered to learn what the insignia meant. "This is my D&D credentials card," she said, holding it out between 2 fingers. I am a serving colonel in the Royal Canadian Air Force, currently traveling on authorized leave following a 2-week parliamentary security briefing in Ottawa. The flight I am boarding in 90 minutes is to Heathrow, where I will be meeting with NATO counterparts. My lounge access was booked and confirmed by my administrative officer at 1 Wing Kingston 3 days ago. I have the confirmation email, the booking reference, and the name of the Air Canada representative who verified the booking if you would like any of them. She paused. Now, I have asked to speak to your supervisor, not you, your supervisor, and I'd like that to happen now, please. Ellison stared at the card. Something behind his eyes flickered. Not quite recognition, not quite retreat. The particular stubbornness of a man who had never developed the wisdom to know when he was already beaten. Rank doesn't entitle you to bypass standard security procedure, he said. It absolutely does not, Nadia agreed, which is why I have complied with every standard security procedure available to me. I presented my maple leaf gold card at the entrance. I presented my boarding pass. I am now presenting government identification. What I have not done, and will not do, is leave this lounge under a cloud of implied theft at your personal direction, without documentation, without my rights being clearly stated, and without your supervisor present. Her voice had dropped to a register that was quieter than anything Ellison had managed, quieter and infinitely more dangerous. So I will ask you one more time, your supervisor's name, and how quickly they can be here. Ellison reached for his radio. What he intended to do with it, whether to call for backup to physically remove her, or whether some vestige of self-preservation was finally surfacing, was never made clear, because at that precise moment the glass doors to the lounge opened and a tall man in a dark grey suit stepped through, phone already at his ear, pausing mid-conversation when his eyes swept the room and landed on Nadia. Brigadier General Lionel Achterberg, Deputy Commander of 1 Canadian Air Division, had been in the lounge for 20 minutes before any of this began. He had been in the private quiet room at the back, taking a call from the base at Cold Lake, and had been on his way back to his seat when he registered the particular quality of silence that fills a public space when something has gone wrong. He was 61 years old, silver-haired and built like the kind of man who had earned every grey hair commanding people through circumstances that would have destroyed someone with a lesser constitution. His suit was civilian, but his lapel pin was not. The maple leaf and crossed swords of a senior Canadian Forces officer, rank device, small enough that most civilians wouldn't place it, large enough that anyone with military literacy would read it instantly. He ended his call. He walked across the lounge at a measured pace, stopping when he was standing directly beside Nadia's chair and facing Ellison across the low table. What is happening here? Achterberg said, not loudly. He had a voice trained to cut through wind on a tarmac and helicopter noise on a flight deck. Indoor conversation required almost no effort at all. Ellison straightened reflexively, the postural residue of a man who had once briefly been someone who answered to authority. Sir, this is a lounge security matter. I'm asking this guest to. This officer, Achterberg said, with a patience so precise it was almost surgical, is Colonel Nadia Osei-Harrington. She is one of the most decorated logistics and strategic command officers in the Royal Canadian Air Force. She holds the Meritorious Service Medal and has served on 3 international deployments. I have personally worked alongside her at NORAD coordination level. He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Now, tell me what legitimate security concern you have that required you to interrupt her afternoon. The flush on Ellison's face had migrated from pink to a colour that wasn't particularly healthy. A guest complaint, sir, regarding her lounge credentials. Her credentials are valid, said Priya from the entrance desk, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. Everyone turned. She had the phone in her hand and a printout she had retrieved from the system without being asked. I verified them on entry. Her Maple Leaf Gold membership is active, her booking was confirmed by Air Canada reservations, and our secondary system also confirmed it. The complaint came from seat 7. She glanced in the direction of a man near the window who had been very studiously examining his laptop for the last 4 minutes. He told me she'd walked in without showing anything. She showed me everything. The man at seat 7 did not look up from his laptop. The silence in the lounge acquired a different texture. Achterberg looked at Ellison for a long moment. You accepted a complaint from another guest, he said slowly, without verifying it against your own desk attendant, who processed the entry, and who was standing 12 feet away from you. Ellison opened his mouth. Do not, Achterberg said quietly, say you were following procedure. I have written security procedure. I have reviewed security procedure at 6 different national facilities. What you were following was an assumption. and the assumption had a very specific shape. He glanced briefly at Nadia, not with pity, she would not have wanted pity, but with the settled, controlled anger of a man who had seen this particular shape before and was done accommodating it. "I'd like the name of your direct supervisor and your employee identification number." Ellison gave both. His voice was barely audible. "Thank you." Achterberg pulled out his own phone and dialed a number from memory. "Graham," he said when the call connected, his eyes remaining on Ellison throughout. "It's Lionel. In the Maple Leaf Lounge at Pearson Terminal 1. I need 5 minutes of your time and I need it now." A pause. "No, I'd rather not get into it on the phone. I think you should come down and see this for yourself." Graham Sutherland, Director of Security Operations for the Greater Toronto Airports Authority, had been in his office on the upper mezzanine of Terminal 1, reviewing incident logs when Achterberg called. He arrived in the lounge 4 minutes later, still holding his coffee. He was a lean, quick-eyed man who had spent 20 years in federal security before moving to the airport authority, and he read the room in approximately 3 seconds. The colonel seated with the contained stillness of someone who has decided not to move, the supervisor, standing with the posture of a man who has realized he is entirely surrounded. The attendant at the desk with a printed verification sheet in her hand, and Achterberg, standing at the center of all of it, like a weather system that had found its target. "Brigadier General." Sutherland set his coffee down on the nearest surface. "Talk to me." Achterberg talked to him. Precisely, chronologically, without editorializing, which, Nadia would reflect later, was more devastating than any emotional account could have been. He described what he had observed when he walked in from the back room. He described what Ellison had said and what Nadia had said. He asked Pryor to repeat what she had already stated regarding the credentials. He mentioned the complaint from seat 7 and the fact that it had not been cross-referenced with the desk attendant before action was taken. Sutherland listened with the expression of a man adding numbers he had been hoping would come out differently. "Graham," Nadia said, speaking for the first time since Achterberg had arrived. "I want to be clear about something. I don't know if what happened here today was deliberate bias or catastrophic process failure. I'm genuinely uncertain, and I think that uncertainty is worth examining carefully." She folded her hands in her lap. "What I am certain about is that a man in a position of authority asked me to leave a room I had every right to be in, based on a complaint he had not verified, and his first instinct when I declined was to threaten me with police removal. That is the part I'd like your organization to think about." Sutherland was already looking at Ellison. The look had nothing warm in it. "Mr. Ellison," he said, "you're relieved for the remainder of this shift. Don't go home, go to HR on level 4 and tell them I sent you. I'll be up within the hour." Ellison looked for a moment as though he might say something. He thought better of it. He unclipped his radio from his belt and set it on the table beside Nadia's untouched sparkling water. He didn't look at her as he left, perhaps he couldn't. After he was gone, the quiet room stayed quiet for a moment longer. And then from somewhere near the window, the retired teacher from Winnipeg began to clap. Once, then twice, and then the man from Calgary who had stopped typing joined in, and then the young woman near the window lowered her phone. Sutherland turned to Nadia and Achterberg. "Colonel, I cannot adequately express my apologies. I would like to speak with you formally before you board, at your convenience, not mine, and I'll ensure your next 6 flights have complimentary lounge access, though I recognize that's a small thing." "It is a small thing," Nadia agreed, "but I'll take it." Achterberg settled back into the chair across from her, waving away the fresh coffee Priya had brought over. He looked at Nadia with the expression of a man who is very tired of something. "This is the 4th time in 3 years," he said quietly. "Not a question." "5th," Nadia said. He let out a long breath. "You know what gets me," he said, "is that, on any other day, in a different set of clothes, this room would have just handed you the coffee and left you alone. The medals don't change. The 38 years of service don't change. But take off the uniform." "And I'm a description on someone else's comfort level," Nadia said. Not with bitterness. She had long since metabolized the bitterness into something harder and more useful. "Yes, I know." She picked up The Economist again, found her page. 3 weeks later, the Greater Toronto Airports Authority released a statement confirming that a security supervisor had been suspended without pay, pending a full review of an incident involving improper handling of a lounge access complaint. The statement was institutional in its language, the kind of language that smooths everything into procedure and removes the human shape of things. What the statement did not mention was that Craig Ellison's personnel file, pulled as part of the review, contained 7 prior complaints from lounge guests, 6 of them from Black or South Asian travelers, all of them following the same pattern of credential file challenges that had been resolved on review without fault on the guest's side. It did not mention that in 5 of those cases, the original complaint had come from a white male passenger seated nearby, and that in all 5, Ellison had acted on the complaint without cross-referencing the desk attendant on duty. The investigator who compiled that report was a former federal civil rights officer named Dennis Brassard, who had been brought in at Sutherland's personal request. Brassard did not use the word pattern in his report. He used the word system, specifically, a system in which the unchecked discretion of one individual had been allowed to calcify into a private operating logic that had gone unexamined for years because its targets had been, in Brassard's precise and careful language, persons who historically faced disproportionate barriers to formal complaint and follow-through. Ellison was not merely suspended, his supervisory certification was revoked. He returned to the authority in a non-public facing role for approximately 3 months before resigning. The attendant named Priya was promoted to Senior Guest Services Coordinator for Terminal 1, effective the following quarter. Sutherland cited her conduct during the incident specifically in the letter of recommendation he attached to her file. Nadia Osei-Harrington, for her part, gave one interview to a CBC journalist who had reached out through the DND media liaison. She was brief, clear, and characteristically precise. "I'm not angry," she said, though her voice carried something more layered than the word could account for. "I'm tired in the way you get tired of a problem that keeps recurring, despite solutions being readily available. We know what bias-informed security escalation looks like. We know what systems allow it to persist. The tools to address it exist. What has historically been missing is the will to apply them consistently, across the board, regardless of who the target is." She paused. What changed that afternoon wasn't the presence of a general or my own credentials or the other passengers watching. What changed it was that one person, the attendant at the desk, did her job correctly and was willing to say so out loud. That's where accountability actually lives, not in the dramatic moments, in the small, mundane ones. She did not mention Ellison's name. She did not need to. The CBC clip ran for 47 seconds online and was shared over 12,000 times in the first 2 days. Most of the comments were variations on a theme, people who had stood exactly where Nadia had stood, in smaller rooms with fewer witnesses, and had not had a general walk through the door at the right moment. That, perhaps, is the part worth sitting with the longest. Not the intervention, not the suspension, not the very satisfying sound of a radio being set down on a table by a man whose shift had just ended in the worst possible way. The part worth holding on to is the question underneath all of it. How many times does this happen when there is no general in the back room, no attendant willing to speak, no phone number on a speed dial that goes directly to someone with the authority to stop it? Justice arrived that afternoon, with witnesses and credentials, and a brigadier general's memory for phone numbers. But the women and men who don't have those things, who stood at the same kind of door and were told to leave, who left, who didn't have 12 people watching, and a printed verification sheet as evidence, they existed before this story, and they exist after it. If this story stayed with you, if it made something in your chest tighten with recognition, or relief, or the particular exhaustion of watching a wrong get righted that shouldn't have needed righting in the first place, share it. Let someone else hear it. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this one from Sounds of Justice, subscribe and stay close. The scales move slowly, but they do move. I keep coming back to the moment Priya picked up the phone. Not the general walking in, not the director arriving with his coffee, not the radio being set down on the table. I keep coming back to a young woman at a check-in desk who had done her job correctly, knew she had done her job correctly, and chose to say so out loud in a room full of people watching to see what would happen next. That's the moment everything turned. Not the credentials, not the rank, not the 4-star adjacency. One person deciding that what she had witnessed was worth standing behind. I think about Nadia Osei-Harrington sitting in that chair with her spine straight and her magazine closed and her hands folded. And I think about what it actually takes to hold yourself that still when someone is trying to move you. Not physically still, that part is almost easier. I mean the other kind. The kind where you don't let the anger sharpen into something that can be used against you, where you stay precise and documented and entirely, deliberately, legible, because you know that the moment you aren't, the story changes and you become the problem. That takes something most people underestimate. It takes intelligence used not just to know your rights, but to exercise them in real time, under pressure, in a room where the default assumption is already running against you. It takes a kind of discipline that doesn't come from nowhere. It's built over years out of necessity. What Ellison counted on, whether he knew it consciously or not, was that the cost of staying would feel higher than the cost of leaving. That's always the calculation. Make the room uncomfortable enough, the ask humiliating enough, the implied threat loud enough, and most people will go. Because most people are tired. Because most people don't have a general in the back room, or a printed verification sheet, or 12 witnesses. Because most people have absorbed, over a lifetime, the lesson that fighting is expensive and leaving is just easier. Nadia had absorbed a different lesson, and what strikes me is that it wasn't about the credentials, or the rank, or who happened to walk through the door at the right time. It was about the decision, made quietly, and without fanfare, that she was not going to participate in her own removal from a room she had every right to be in. That's a moral choice before it's anything else. A choice about what you owe yourself and what you're willing to let pass unchallenged because the moment is inconvenient. The consequences that followed. Ellison's suspension, the review, the 7 prior complaints finally seeing daylight, Priya's promotion, those didn't happen by accident. They happened because Nadia held her ground long enough for the truth to catch up with the situation. That's how accountability usually works, when it works at all. Not in a flash, not automatically. It requires someone to stay in the room. I think that's the thing worth carrying out of this story, not the satisfying part where the radio hits the table. The part before it, when it would have been so much easier to just go.